Imagine, for a moment, that you are in an intergalactic classroom, surrounded by beings from all corners of the galaxy. Powerful, technological, and advanced races that have explored the far reaches of the universe and mastered the art of living without risks, without the pain of challenge. Now imagine that you are one of these students, about to hear about the one planet that defies everything you know. Earth, a truly insane planet, a death world, where danger is not just an obstacle to be overcome, but a fuel that drives life itself. But wait, you're hearing this from an alien professor, a member of an intellectual race that can barely comprehend how such fragile beings as humans can not only survive, but thrive in a world full of deadly predators and extreme challenges. They ask themselves, how are humans still here after everything? Miss Ricky, a wise alien from the Zamra race, is about to reveal the secret that humans carry, the unshakable courage to face death at every step. Here's the question: why is Earth called the Death World? Because humans haven't just survived in this relentless place, they've turned it into their advantage. They evolved in an environment where predators still reign, where the immense gravity would crush almost any other being, and where even sports are ways of pushing the limits to the extreme. What the advanced races of the Confederation don't realize is that humanity's true strength comes from its ability to adapt, to endure, and to fight, not just to survive, but to master risk itself. This is not just a story about a deadly planet. It's about how humans defied the odds and built their greatness. Get ready to discover why, when the most advanced races look at Earth, they don't just see a hostile world, they see a challenge that cannot be ignored. The classroom was in a frantic uproar, as was common before any major revelation. Alien students from countless races and planets were gathered, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. The sound of mixed conversations and buzzing echoed through the vast hall, until, with a simple gesture, Miss Ricky, an imposing figure of the Zamra race, silenced the chaos. Her long, sharp claws tapped against the table with a clear and decisive rhythm. A faint metallic breeze spread through the air, making even the most powerful students fall silent. She was ready to speak about a subject that carried an unusual fascination, something that sparked more questions than answers. Earth, the birthplace of humans. The moment she began to speak, the students instantly realized that this lesson would be far from ordinary. Miss Ricky already knew that Earth was a point of curiosity and confusion within the Confederation, a world classified as a death world by its own inhabitants. But to those present, it was nothing more than a primitive planet full of contradictions, where life seemed to be in a constant battle for survival. She knew it wouldn't be easy to teach her students why Earth was such a unique place. A world filled with savage predators, extreme gravity, and a natural balance that, at first glance, seemed to defy the very laws of evolution. "All right then," she began, her eyes gleaming with deep knowledge. "Today, we are going to understand why this world, Earth, is still considered one of the greatest mysteries of the galaxy, and perhaps the greatest enigma in human history." With every word, Miss Ricky knew that, to those in the room, Earth was just another distant curiosity. The students, most of them from peaceful worlds, from ecosystems controlled and calibrated to ensure survival, could never truly imagine the wild chaos that ruled that planet. But that was the essence of the problem. That's what makes humans so. "Interesting," she said, provoking a murmur throughout the room. "Let's talk about their planet's extreme gravity. Are you ready?" A buzz of conversation rippled through the classroom. Those accustomed to controlled gravity in their own worlds, where weight was regulated by advanced technologies, could hardly fathom what it meant to live on a planet where simply walking on its surface was a constant challenge. But Miss Ricky knew that this was the first step to understanding the human body's adaptation, something the aliens of the Confederation still struggled to fully comprehend. The human body, forced to evolve under Earth's extreme gravity, had developed in ways no other species in the galaxy had ever been required to. As a result, humans gained strength, endurance, and perhaps the most remarkable ability of all, resilience. Yet, for the students in that room, this concept was entirely new. They, who were used to a predictable and controlled environment, began to question what it truly meant to be human. How could a species shaped by such a brutal world, where nature itself seemed to conspire against them, survive and even thrive? That was the great question. How could a species so primitive, one with a history drenched in internal conflicts, destruction, and endless wars, not only survive, but also prosper among the stars? Earth wasn't just a planet with a hostile environment. It was a natural training ground that forged humans into something unique. Now pay close attention, Miss Ricky continued. Let's take a deeper step into this story. I want you to think about the predators. And I'm not just talking about the dinosaurs that are long gone, but about the wild creatures that still dominate the planet. Do you think humans live in domes or artificial environments? Her eyes gleamed with a hint of sarcasm. Well, they don't just coexist with these creatures, they face them in a daily struggle for survival. And that was when the lesson truly became interesting. The image of predators, bears, wolves, lions, and sharks, hunting mercilessly, began to take hold in the students' minds. Humanity didn't just survive these threats, they evolved because of them. Miss Ricky knew this was the turning point, and soon they would all understand. She paused, scanning her students, who were now visibly engaged. The concept of adaptation in a world full of relentless predators was starting to make sense. For humans, danger wasn't just a factor to be eliminated. It was a force that pushed them to become stronger, smarter, and faster. It was a mindset that no other species possessed. They didn't exterminate Earth's predators. On the contrary, they kept them alive because, without these challenges, the natural balance would collapse. The struggle for survival was essential in building a resilient society. And that was what the aliens, with all their technology and refinement, failed to understand. The classroom was now in absolute silence. Each student, from different planets and backgrounds, was absorbing the magnitude of this human philosophy. How was it possible? How could a species become strong not through weapons or cybernetic enhancements, but through constant adaptation and facing deadly threats? The answer was about to be revealed, but first, Miss Ricky posed another thought-provoking question. And what lies ahead if these humans are so willing to face death even now? That means their challenges are not just physical, but psychological as well. With this, she laid the groundwork for a deeper level of understanding, the human psyche in the face of mortality. And somehow, everyone in the room knew they were only beginning to grasp what made humans so dangerous. Miss Ricky carefully observed her students' faces. They were all visibly shaken by the picture she had just painted of Earth. To them, the planet had seemed like nothing more than a distant blue dot, without any real significance, a place full of primitive, savage species, nothing more. But something else was being conveyed, something far deeper. She knew the truth about Earth was more complex than any of the races present could ever imagine. Though small compared to many other planets, Earth had an ecosystem so ruthless and yet so fascinating that no other world in the galaxy could even compare. Why was Earth called the Deathworld? She asked, pausing intentionally. Her students, eager for a logical answer, expected something obvious, perhaps a catastrophic event or an intergalactic war. But Miss Ricky knew that what humans had truly faced went far beyond a mere war or disaster. She began to explain with scientific precision, but also with a touch of enthusiasm, as if revealing a secret kept for millennia. Earth's gravity, she explained, was the first clue to its unique nature. The extreme gravity of this world, far stronger than that of any other inhabited planet, posed a challenge for any biological being. For thousands of years, the human body had to adapt to this relentless pressure, evolving to become strong, flexible, and resilient, far beyond what any species in the Confederation could comprehend. But gravity is not the only reason, Miss Ricky continued, provoking a slight murmur among the students. Earth's biodiversity is unpredictable, almost chaotic. A human who survives here is not just physically strong. They are adaptable, ingenious, and resilient. The animals, the plants, And even the climate of Earth are in a constant state of change. Nothing is as comfortable or stable as on the planets controlled by the Confederation. The room grew even quieter, and a student of the HFY race, a curious and skeptical young one, raised his hand with an intrigued expression. "But Professor, how can that be possible? Don't they try to control their planet's conditions like we do?" Miss Ricky smiled gently, as if she had been expecting that question. "No, HFY. They chose not to control it. Because for humans, the constant struggle against such a hostile environment is what defines them. Risk and danger are what drive their progress. They did not create an artificial world to live in. They shaped their bodies and minds to survive in true wilderness." She let those words settle in the room, knowing they were planting a seed of doubt in her students' minds. How could a species evolve in such a way, willingly subjecting themselves to such a brutal environment? The idea that Earth was a chaotic world, where life constantly adapted to survive, seemed absurd to many of the aliens present. They were beings from peaceful, controlled worlds, where climate and conditions were, in some way, predictable. Moreover, their species had been technologically enhanced to eliminate any threat, any risk to their survival. They lived under a regime of absolute security, where balance was maintained by advanced technologies. The notion that humans had not only survived but evolved in such an unpredictable world challenged all their conceptions of evolution and adaptation. Miss Ricky was unfazed by their reactions. She knew that the key to understanding humans lay in their actions, not just their biology. Humans didn't just survive. They lived as if every moment were a battle, as if they were constantly challenging themselves, always seeking the next obstacle to overcome. They were not merely adaptable beings. They were creatures that saw the struggle for life as an opportunity to grow, to test themselves, to transform. The true strength of humans lies not only in their biology, but in the way their minds and bodies are shaped under the pressure of constant extinction threats, said Miss Ricky, her words echoing through the room like a distant reverberation. But she did not stop there. Miss Ricky wanted more than just scientific explanations. She wanted her students to feel the gravity of the situation. Look, all of you know that in your cultures, survival is ensured by eliminating risk. But what if I told you that humans did not eliminate risk, but embraced it as part of their journey? They chose to live alongside predators, chaos, and death. And that is the main reason why Earth is called a death world. Not because death is everywhere, but because humans themselves have the courage to face it and thrive. The students were now fixated on Miss Ricky, no longer mocking or questioning her explanation. She knew that, even though it was difficult for them to grasp, a seed had been planted. The students were beginning to understand that Earth was not just a dangerous place. It was a training ground for evolution, where death was not the enemy to be avoided, but the fuel for life. A world that, despite all its hardships, had forged one of the most formidable and resilient species the galaxy had ever known. Miss Ricky observed her students for a moment, before leaning slightly forward. So, we can conclude that Earth is not just a death world. It is the origin of something far more complex, something that perhaps none of you fully understand yet. Because what makes Earth dangerous is not just its physical conditions, but the way its inhabitants behave in the face of danger. And that, my dear students, is what makes humans a true threat. Miss Ricky watched the students intently, as if waiting for the weight of her words about Earth to settle into their minds. The room was quieter now, with all eyes fixed on her, awaiting the next step in her explanation. And she knew exactly what to do to capture their full attention. With a calm gesture, she began to speak about what, to the aliens, was one of humanity's greatest mysteries, the body and mind of a human being. Now that you understand the unforgiving environment of Earth, let's talk about humans themselves. How are they able to withstand so many hardships? How can a body so small, compared to yours, endure such extreme conditions? Miss Ricky paused strategically. She knew that, for her students, the concept of human physical and mental strength was difficult to grasp. The Yorel, with their massive and robust bodies, believed that strength lay in musculature, exoskeletons, and biological enhancements. But for humans, strength was something completely different, a matter of adaptation and evolution, forged through time and experience. They didn't need major physical modifications or technological augmentations like so many other species did. The true strength of humans lay in their ability to adapt, in their incredible resilience in the face of chaos and pain. Humans, Miss Riki continued, do not have the brute strength of a species like the Yorel, nor the physical endurance of many races in the Confederation. But what they do have, what truly sets them apart, is their mind and their ability to physically adapt to the most extreme conditions. She gestured with her claws, pointing to a screen projecting images of humans training under extreme gravity, climbing mountains, subjecting themselves to grueling conditions that would nearly break any other species. They become stronger, faster, smarter, because they don't just try to survive, they challenge themselves constantly, relentlessly. The human body, like a machine, learns to endure extremes. The room was completely silent. The idea of humans deliberately pushing their own limits seemed incomprehensible to many of the species present. Then, Miss Riki projected footage of human training sessions in high-gravity environments, where even the simplest movement became a battle for survival. "What you need to understand," she said, her deep voice resonating through the room, "is that humans do not rely on technology to become strong. While you use exoskeletons, cybernetic enhancements, and devices to ensure your physical capabilities never fail, humans submit themselves to pain, to effort, to the constant battle against nature. And that is what makes them truly dangerous." Miss Riki knew she was making a crucial point. If there was one thing that set humans apart from the other beings of the Confederation, it was their ability to face adversity without resorting to technology as a shortcut. Every time a human climbs a mountain or endures the crushing gravity of their Earth, they are not just training their bodies, she continued. They are shaping their minds, their willpower. They don't just challenge the world around them, they challenge themselves. And when that happens, the human body becomes a refined machine, adaptable to any situation. And the human mind... the human mind is even more impressive, because it is through their minds that they surpass limits that would be impossible for any other species to overcome. The sight of humans enduring extreme gravity or simply withstanding the scorching heat of a desert was beginning to sink in for the students. They, who took pride in their cybernetic enhancements and biological advantages, were now starting to question whether those truly made them superior. But humans are not defined by their bodies or their minds alone, Miss Riki said, a knowing smile creeping onto her face. Humans possess something that no other race does: resilience. She looked around the room and saw her students struggling to grasp what she was saying. Resilience, she explained, was the ability to recover from adversity, to rise after every fall. For humans, every defeat, every wound, every loss was not the end, but an opportunity to grow stronger. This was something they, as a species, had learned the hard way. They had endured wars, natural disasters, even the extinction of multiple species. And yet, humans continued to grow, to thrive, to conquer new horizons. This is the secret of humans, Miss Riki concluded. They are not afraid of pain or death. They understand that these things are part of the process. They live with death at their side, but they never let it defeat them. The room was silent, every student reflecting on her words. Humanity, with all its weaknesses and contradictions, had built a society that didn't just survive chaos. It rose from it stronger with each generation. That was the true strength of humans, and that was what made them a threat. When Miss Riki began speaking about Earth's predators, the classroom filled with murmurs of excitement and disbelief. The concept of predators, especially natural predators, was so alien to many of the races present that it felt more like science fiction than reality. After all, in their civilizations, most natural threats had been eradicated or domesticated. The controlled world of the Confederation had no ruthless predators that hunted for either pleasure or necessity. So the idea that a species could coexist with such terrifying creatures was unsettling. Miss Riki, however, was determined to show her students how humans not only coexisted with these predators, but, in a way, considered them an essential part of Earth's balance. Humans have a very peculiar philosophy, she explained, projecting images of bears, wolves, lions, and sharks hunting in their natural habitats. They don't try to exterminate threats. On the contrary, threats are part of what keeps them strong. The classroom fell silent. Those accustomed to living in worlds of absolute safety could barely comprehend how humans had not only survived, but thrived alongside predators that would be fatal to any other species. These bears, Miss Riki continued, pointing to an image of a massive grizzly bear running at an incredible 56 km/h, are not just a threat. They are a lesson in resilience. These predators teach humans to be faster, stronger, and more cunning. They force the species to evolve, to improve every day. The students were impressed, but still skeptical. But why don't humans try to exterminate them? They have the technology for it, questioned a young optician student, clearly intrigued by the idea of not eliminating such threats. Miss Riki smiled softly. Because humans have understood something that many other species have yet to grasp, the importance of balance. She explained that, for humans, life is not about absolute safety, but about maintaining equilibrium with the forces of nature. Imagine, if humans had exterminated all these predators, Miss Riki said, gesturing with her hand, what would remain? A world without challenges. A world where life becomes monotonous, with no evolution or adaptation. That is not something humans desire. They know that to stay strong, they need danger, constant struggle. The presence of these predators forces them to always be alert, always ready. The reaction in the classroom was a mix of fascination and perplexity. It was difficult for many of the species to understand how something so dangerous could be seen as necessary. The idea that humans not only coexisted with but embraced the presence of such predators was a difficult lesson to grasp. The concept of risk, of living with death around them, seemed strange even to the most resilient species of the Confederation. They, who had eradicated all forms of danger, were now confronted with a truth that challenged the very foundation of their peaceful existence. To humans, predators were not just threats to be defeated. They were an essential part of the tapestry of life, helping to create the conditions that made humans so unique. And it's not just the bears, Miss Riki continued, her tone growing darker as she projected images of wolves, lions, and sharks in action. These predators are everywhere. In every corner of Earth, humans face creatures like these wild felines and killer sharks, which hunt out of necessity and sometimes for pleasure. But unlike other species, humans don't try to eradicate these predators. They respect them. She paused, letting her words resonate throughout the room. They respect the challenge they represent. And that is what makes humans dangerous. Their ability to thrive in the presence of such threats. The room was utterly silent. Some students were still trying to grasp what this meant. Others were beginning to realize that the true strength of humans lay not only in their biology, but in how they faced danger. To them, predators were part of the very definition of life. They knew that each encounter with a threat could be fatal, yet they did not shy away. They advanced, confronted fear, and often emerged victorious. This is the human mindset, Miss Riki said, her voice deep and full of respect. They are not afraid of being hunted. They are afraid of no longer being challenged. She concluded, with a thought that left the students with an unsettling sense of unease. Perhaps on some level, humans are more dangerous than any other species in the galaxy. Because they don't need to eradicate death. They know they face it. And yet, they still choose to live courageously. And that is what makes Earth a death world. Not the number of predators, but the courage of humans to face death, constantly, in every moment of their lives. Miss Riki carefully observed her students' faces as she moved on to the next topic. She knew that many of them had heard about humans and their sports, but what she was about to reveal was something far more complex. For many of the species present, sports were a form of leisure, a friendly competition to keep bodies fit and spirits high. But for humans, sports were more than just games. They were a testament to strength, endurance, courage, and above all, the ability to face their own mortality. And the most impressive part, humans loved these challenges. Now that you understand how humans coexist with predators and survive in a relentless world, prepare yourselves for the most intriguing aspect of their existence, began Miss Ricky, her voice carrying a certain reverence. On Earth, they do not seek safety or comfort. On the contrary, humans seek risk. They seek danger. And what is most fascinating, they have created sports that mimic the most extreme conditions of their reality. She gestured toward a screen which displayed images of humans climbing steep rock faces without any safety equipment. This is their sport, free solo climbing. They risk their lives, not because they lack fear, but because they understand that fear is a force that must be overcome. The classroom fell into complete silence, the students now struggling to grasp the human mentality. To them, the idea of taking unnecessary risks seemed insane. Raised in controlled environments where danger was something to be avoided at all costs, they could hardly comprehend how humans not only tolerated risk, but actively sought it. Miss Ricky smiled as she observed the bewildered expressions of her students. But that's not all. Humans also engage in other deadly sports, like cave diving, where death literally lurks in the shadows, waiting for a single mistake, or rodeo, where they ride wild animals with nothing but their courage and skill as protection. She paused, allowing the images of a human rider atop a raging bull to burn into the students' minds. The idea of willingly subjecting oneself to such danger, with no guarantee of success, was an utterly alien concept to many in the room. But to humans, it was an essential part of life. These sports are not just for entertainment, Miss Ricky continued, her voice now more solemn. They are a way to test one's own limits, to face death head-on. To humans, confronting death is not a curse but an opportunity to prove themselves, to show that even at the brink, they are stronger. And of course, she went on, there are the bloody fights, where humans battle each other in fierce combat, with the sole purpose of testing their physical and mental endurance. The blood they shed is not just a mark of battle, but a symbol of their resilience, their refusal to surrender. Miss Ricky knew that this part of human culture was viewed with a certain horror by other races. But to her, it only reinforced the idea that humans were a unique species. They did not merely survive. They wanted more. They wanted to push the very limits of life and death. These sports are not just a form of amusement for them, Miss Ricky explained, a spark of admiration in her eyes. They represent the fight for life. Because in the end, humans do not see death as an end, but as a stage in the process of evolution. They challenge themselves, they push their limits, and in doing so, they become stronger, more resilient. She observed her students, noticing that some were beginning to grasp the magnitude of this concept. They are not afraid of failure. They are afraid of not trying. That is what makes them so dangerous. They do not settle. They do not stagnate. They grow, even through pain. The classroom was quieter than ever, every student absorbing Miss Ricky's words. For many, the idea of risking one's life for a mere challenge was incomprehensible. But for humans, it was the fuel that kept them alive, that drove them to strive for more. They did not need a grand purpose to live. The simple act of facing the unknown, of staring death in the eye, was what motivated them to move forward. And that is why humans are such a formidable race, Miss Ricky concluded, her voice now resonating with deep respect. They are not afraid to take risks. They understand that risk is what keeps them alive. As Miss Ricky spoke of the deadly sports and the unshakable courage of humans, she couldn't help but notice that her students were beginning to see humans in a new light. They were not just weak beings, as many had assumed, nor a primitive species, as the more cynical believed. They were something more, something the Confederation had yet to fully comprehend. But Miss Ricky knew that Unlike the other races of the Confederation, humans had no desire to conquer the universe. They were not conquerors, they were explorers. And that was the true reason why the Confederation still feared them. Now that you have an idea of what makes humans so special, let's talk about what really matters, Miss Riki began, her voice carrying a certain lightness. Despite all their extraordinary achievements, humans do not seek to conquer the galaxy. They have no interest in subjugating other races or expanding their empire. She paused, allowing her words to settle. They prefer to integrate. They form bonds with species that other races in the Confederation avoid, with those even the Council considers undesirable. Miss Riki knew this was the most intriguing part of the human story. They were not just adaptable in physical or mental terms. They were socially flexible, capable of forming alliances with any species, regardless of their origin, biology, or history. The students were now in a state of confusion mixed with fascination. Raised in societies where hierarchy and the purity of their own race were fundamental, they could hardly grasp the concept of a species that welcomed any being, any species, into its community. Humans do not limit themselves to working only with similar races, Miss Riki explained. They don't see others as enemies or inferiors. They see themselves as part of something greater, something that transcends the borders of their own cultures and planets. They form alliances, and those alliances are based on a simple principle: give and receive. The room was in absolute silence. The idea that humans united through a code of cooperation, rather than conquest, was a completely new notion for the students. This is what sets humans apart from most races in the Confederation, Miss Riki continued, observing the impact of her words. They ask for nothing in return for their help. When they helped the Jinn avoid extinction, they demanded nothing. They weren't seeking power, nor were they looking for advantages. They helped simply because they believed it was the right thing to do. She leaned forward slightly, her claws softly touching the table. This behavior is unusual, even among us in the Confederation. For many races, survival and success depend on strategic alliances or beneficial exchanges. But humans do this out of pure kindness, out of an innate impulse to do what is right. This makes them both dangerous and fascinating. Miss Riki knew the students were beginning to understand that humans were not just a species that had overcome their natural challenges. They were a species that brought something more to the galaxy, a desire to cooperate, to join forces with others to achieve a common goal. But that does not mean humans are innocent, she warned, her tone turning graver. When provoked, they can be ruthless. They do not attack on a whim, but out of necessity. They have a code, something that guides their actions. The code of give and receive. If you attack a human, they will destroy you completely. And if you work with them, you will be surprised by the help they can offer. Miss Riki knew the students were beginning to grasp the depth of human nature. They were beings who, though peaceful and cooperative, did not hesitate to use their strength and abilities when necessary. And that was a balance few races could understand. If you truly want to understand the impact of humans on the Confederation, Miss Riki said, her voice growing more intense, you must realize that their greatest strength does not lie in their ability to fight or conquer. Their true strength lies in their ability to influence other races, to turn enemies into allies, and to bring peace where there was once conflict. She let those words hang in the air, knowing that, no matter how well the students grasped them, intellectually, there was still much to be learned about the true nature of humans. They were not a threat simply because of their strength or resilience. They were a threat because they could change the course of history, forge unlikely alliances, and unify races under a common cause. The room remained silent, the students reflecting on the impact humans could have on the galaxy. Miss Riki, with her deep knowledge, understood that the fear other races felt was not just due to their strength, but their ability to unite, to transform. They were indeed one of the most powerful races in the galaxy, and while that made them valuable allies, it also made them, in a way, dangerous. They did not seek to dominate. They sought to evolve, to grow, and eventually, to change the universe around them. And that, more than anything else, made them a force to be reckoned with. Miss Ricky knew there was a part of the human story her students would find hard to believe, but she could not ignore it. When she started talking about the resurrection of extinct species, the room immediately filled with murmurs and incredulous looks. The idea of bringing back creatures from the past was so absurd to the students of the Confederation that, for a moment, she wondered if they would truly grasp the magnitude of what humans were attempting to do. "Did you know," she began, her voice full of meaning, "that humans have managed to revive extinct species? They brought back the Tasmanian tiger, for example." The room fell into absolute silence, all the students' eyes fixed on her, waiting for more information. "But it doesn't stop there," Miss Ricky continued, her tone turning slightly darker. "Humans are discussing the possibility of resurrecting other ancient species. Some even talk about dinosaurs." She paused, allowing the students to process the idea. "This may seem like madness, reckless, even impossible to you, right? But for humans, it is an expression of their own arrogance and desire to control nature. They don't just bring these creatures back as a scientific study. They do it because they believe they can tame them." Miss Ricky knew she was touching on a deep subject. Dinosaurs, majestic creatures that ruled the earth millions of years ago, were now seen as an irresistible temptation for humanity. The students were visibly shaken, trying to grasp what was being said. "But why resurrect such dangerous creatures?" asked a young Yorl, clearly concerned about the implications. "Why not leave them where they are, in the past?" Miss Ricky smiled, softly, knowing that, to them, the idea of reviving a dinosaur was senseless. For the Yorl, the logic was simple. Dangerous things should be eradicated, not recreated. But humans thought differently. Because for humans, mastering nature doesn't mean eliminating it. They understand it, study it, respect it, but they also believe they have the power to bring back what was lost. She leaned forward, her voice becoming more intense. They are willing to risk everything, to defy natural laws, all in the name of their desire for power. The idea that humans were toying with the concept of resurrecting extinct species seemed so absurd to the students that some began to laugh nervously. But Miss Ricky was not joking. She knew that, no matter how vulnerable and flawed humans were, there was something about them that made them unpredictable, something the other races could never fully comprehend. "You think this is mere scientific curiosity?" she asked, scanning the room. "Maybe for some races it is. But for humans, this temptation to revive the past is not just about studying what once was. It's about seeking power, trying to correct mistakes, challenging death itself, and even time." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The silence in the room was now heavy, loaded with the realization that perhaps humans were not as simple as they seemed. The real question is, how far are humans willing to go with this? They have already revived one extinct species, and who's to say what else they might bring back? Dinosaurs are only the beginning. Humans have the desire to conquer even the greatest mysteries of nature, and that, in itself, is a powerful force. Miss Ricky knew she was stirring emotions and shaking the fundamental beliefs of her students. To them, control over life and death was an untouchable power. But to humans, it seemed to be just another step in their constant challenge against mortality. "Now imagine if humans actually succeeded in resurrecting dinosaurs," she said, projecting images of enormous creatures crawling across the earth before meeting their extinction. What would happen? Earth, this world of death, would become a battlefield between the human species and these prehistoric predators. And once again, humans would have to adapt, to evolve, to become stronger in order to survive a new kind of danger. The room was tense, all the students now beginning to grasp the potential humans possessed, for better or for worse. But the question remains, do humans truly have control over this? Or are they merely playing with forces they themselves do not understand? She took one final pause, looking around the room, her piercing gaze locking onto each student. What is clear? is that with humans, you never know how far they will go. And that is the real danger. They are not afraid to take risks. They are not afraid of death. They face the unknown, and sometimes they even bring it back. And with that, Miss Ricky concluded her explanation, leaving the students with a new understanding, or perhaps a new concern, about the true nature of humans.